There are moments when your heart burns to move, to decide, to act, to fix something before it falls apart. You feel the pressure of time, the pounding urgency that whispers, if you don't do it now, you'll lose everything. Yet beneath that voice of panic, there is another, quieter, slower, wiser, urging you to wait. Because sometimes the difference between destiny and disaster is 24 hours. Proverbs tells us, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." And though those words sound ancient, they are painfully modern. We live in a world that glorifies immediacy, where decisions are made on impulse, where emotion replaces wisdom, and where reaction masquerades as faith. But the Spirit of God does not rush, He reveals. And those who wait upon Him often find that what looked urgent was actually a trap, and what looked delayed was divine protection. So before you send that message, before you quit, before you buy it, sign it, end it, or chase it, give God one full day, one night of silence, one sunrise to whisper what the storm in your emotions cannot. Because in 24 hours, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, and what once felt right in the heat of reaction may crumble in the light of peace. This is not hesitation, it's holy timing. And if you can learn to pause before you decide, you might just find that waiting isn't wasting, it's wisdom in disguise. The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and slows your breath. David sat alone at his small wooden table, the faint light of a single candle flickering against the rough edges of his Bible. His phone lay face down beside it, screen dark, though he could feel it humming faintly, like temptation disguised as urgency. He had a decision to make, one that could change everything. His job had become unbearable, the company corrupt, the people draining. An offer from another firm had arrived that morning. Higher pay, better title, everything he had prayed for on paper. But something in him hesitated, not because it looked wrong, but because it looked to right. It glittered like an answer that arrived before the question had even fully formed. He wanted to take it desperately, yet that quiet voice in his spirit, the one that never shouted, whispered, "Wait." He tried to silence it. He opened his email, ready to accept the offer. But his eyes caught the flicker of a verse on the page before him. Proverbs 19:2. "Desire without knowledge is not good, and whoever makes haste with his feet misses his way." The words pierced through his restlessness like a blade of light cutting fog. He set the pen down. His pulse slowed, but his mind screamed. What if waiting meant missing out? What if someone else took the offer first? What if this was his chance, the one he had begged God for? That's when he remembered his grandmother's voice from years ago, the one who had carried faith like a mantle passed through generations. She used to tell him, when the devil can't destroy you, he'll hurry you. And so he waited, not because he felt peace, but because he didn't. He gave God 24 hours, a full rotation of the earth, to show him what his emotions could not. The first few hours were agony. Every minute that passed felt like surrendering control. His chest ached with indecision, his mind pacing in circles, replaying all the what-ifs that make faith feel foolish. But something began to happen as the night deepened. A stillness began to form inside him. It wasn't clarity yet, but it was peace. And peace, he remembered, was always the language of God. He turned off his phone completely and opened his Bible again. His eyes landed this time on Proverbs 3-6. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. He whispered into the candlelight, then make it straight, Lord, because I can't tell where it leads anymore. Outside his window, the moon hovered low, casting pale light through the trees. The night felt sacred, like heaven had drawn a curtain around him and said, "Be still." He fell asleep in that stillness. His Bible open beside him, unaware that while he rested, God was already rearranging something unseen. His phone buzzed violently against the table. He groaned, half asleep, and picked it up. It was a message from an old colleague, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. "Hey, David," it read, "just a heads up, that company you mentioned in your post last week. Big scandal hitting the news this morning. They're freezing all contracts. Something about fraudulent reporting." He sat up, pulse hammering in his ears. His candle had burned out completely, leaving a trail of wax like a melted hourglass on the table. He opened his laptop, searching the headlines, and there it was. The offer that had promised him everything was now a crumbling facade. David sank back into his chair, a trembling laugh escaping his throat. Not mockery, relief, gratitude, awe, he whispered. 24 hours. If he had moved on impulse, if he had signed that night, his life would have changed. Yes, but in all the wrong ways. He closed his eyes, humbled by the thought. Maybe God's no isn't always rejection. Maybe it's redirection disguised as delay. He poured himself a cup of coffee and watched the first rays of light break through the window. The same sun that rose for kings and shepherds now rose for him, to remind him that God's timing was not slow. It was perfect. And as the morning light filled the room, something inside him whispered, "This is why I told you to wait." The next day unfolded slower than usual, as if time itself had been instructed to move gently. David walked through the morning with a strange mixture of calm and trembling gratitude. He couldn't shake the thought that he had almost stepped into ruin, disguised as reward. And the thought terrified him, not because of what he had nearly lost, but because of how right it had felt. It was humbling, even frightening, to realize how deception can wear the costume of destiny. He brewed another cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the soft gray light of morning clouds drifting like old prayers across the sky. For the first time in months, he wasn't rushing. There was no pressure to prove, no internal voice screaming to act. The world was still moving, yes, but he no longer felt enslaved to its pace. He opened his Bible again, not searching this time, just listening. His eyes landed on Proverbs 16-9. The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. He read it slowly, letting each word sink deep into the silence of his soul. He realized that maybe the greatest act of faith wasn't moving forward. It was learning when to be still. As he meditated, a thought began to rise, subtle but powerful. Waiting on God doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing the right thing at the right time with the right spirit. It means pausing long enough to hear the difference between your fear and his voice. David smiled faintly. "The difference between fear and faith," he whispered, "is patience." He decided to take a walk, something he hadn't done without purpose in a long while. The streets were damp from an early drizzle, the air cool with the scent of rain. He walked aimlessly, his steps guided not by destination, but by rhythm. Each footfall felt like a heartbeat syncing with something eternal as he turned the corner. He passed an elderly woman sitting on a bench near a small chapel. She was feeding pigeons from a cloth bag, humming softly to herself. Her eyes caught his, and she smiled, a knowing kind of smile that seemed older than her wrinkles. "Morning," she said, her voice warm like sunlight through stained glass. "You look like a man who's waiting on something." David chuckled nervously. "Something like that." "Ah," she nodded, tossing another handful of crumbs. "The waiting season. It's the hardest one, but that's where he does his best work, you know?" He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She turned to him fully, her gaze steady. "When the seed is buried, it looks like nothing's happening. But underground, everything's changing. Roots are growing where no one can see. And when the time comes, what blooms doesn't come from effort, it comes from trust." He felt those words pierce something deep inside him. "I almost made a big decision yesterday," he said. "Something that would have destroyed me, I think. But I waited just for one night. And this morning, everything became clear." She smiled again, eyes glimmering. "That's because revelation lives on the other side of rest. God speaks when you stop trying to shout over him." He wanted to ask her more, but when he turned for a moment to look at the street, a delivery truck passed between them. When it moved on, she was gone. The bench was empty, crumbs scattered like snow. He stood there, stunned, scanning the sidewalk. There was nowhere she could have gone that fast. A chill ran down his spine. He looked toward the chapel, its doors slightly open, candlelight flickering from within. He walked toward it slowly, reverently, feeling a strange pull. Inside, the air smelled of incense and old wood. The soft echo of distant hymns filled the space. He knelt near the altar, unsure why. He whispered, "Was that you?" No voice replied. No thunder rolled. But he felt a deep peace descend on him, the kind that fills the air so thickly you could almost touch it. It wasn't an answer. It was assurance. He stayed there for a while, silent, eyes closed. When he finally stood, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Carved into the stone archway above the altar were faint words in Latin. He couldn't read all of it, but one phrase was clear: Sub silentio dies loquitur. Under silence, God speaks. He smiled through tears. That evening, he returned home different, lighter, grounded, steady. He didn't feel the need to control outcomes anymore. The next door God opened, he decided he would not push. He would walk through when it was ready. And though he didn't know it yet, that moment of surrender would become the hinge on which his entire life turned. Because sometimes, the miracle isn't that God changes your situation, it's that He changes you first. And once the heart aligns with heaven's timing, everything else begins to move. That night, the sky stretched vast and black above the city, a deep velvet canvas streaked with the silver breath of stars. David sat on his balcony, the soft hum of night traffic fading into the distance, his mind replaying every event of the past 2 days. How something as small as waiting, as invisible as silence, could shift the very foundation of his heart. He thought of the woman on the bench, the way her words carried weight, as though heaven itself had borrowed her voice. Under silence, God speaks. That phrase kept circling in his mind like an orbiting truth he could no longer escape. He realized that what had once felt like divine distance was actually divine discipline, God teaching him that clarity was never the reward of panic, but of peace. He glanced at his phone on the table. Messages piled up from coworkers, recruiters, even friends who didn't understand why he hadn't leaped at the offer. "You're crazy," one text said. "This could have been your break." But he smiled, shaking his head. They couldn't know what he knew now. They hadn't seen the headlines. They hadn't heard that still, small whisper at midnight that said, "Wait." He poured himself a cup of tea and opened his Bible again. This time, his eyes landed on Proverbs 4:26. "Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure." The verse wasn't just instruction, it was revelation. God was not asking him to walk faster. He was teaching him to walk wisely. For the first time in years, David began to journal. He wrote about his impulses, his impatience, his hunger for immediate answers. And as he wrote, he felt something uncoil within him, the tension between faith and control slowly loosening. He began to see that every spiritual attack in his life had disguised itself as urgency. The enemy had never needed to destroy him outright. All he needed was to rush him into ruin. He wrote one sentence, slowly, almost as if engraving it onto his own heart. "If the decision requires panic, it's probably not from God." That line would become his compass in the years to come. The next morning, he rose early, before dawn. Something in him stirred, a call, a pull, a quiet nudge toward the chapel once more. When he arrived, the heavy wooden doors creaked as he entered, the light inside dim and golden. A priest was sweeping the aisles, the soft scrape of the broom echoing like rhythm. "Peace be with you," the priest said with a smile. David nodded. "And with you." He hesitated, then asked, "Father, what does it mean when God seems silent, but you feel peace anyway?" The priest paused, leaning on his broom. "Ah," he said, eyes glinting. "When the teacher is silent, it means the test has begun. But peace in the silence, that means you already have the answer." David let those words sink in. He sat on the nearest pew and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of stillness settle around him again in that quiet. His mind drifted back to the past, to every door he had forced open in his life, every decision made out of fear of being left behind. The relationships that had ended painfully, the jobs that drained his soul, the paths that led to emptiness. They all had one thing in common. He hadn't waited. Tears welled in his eyes. He whispered, "Lord, how many times have I run ahead of you?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, thick with unseen presence. A beam of morning light slipped through the stained glass, painting his face in a mosaic of color, blue, gold, crimson. It was as if God himself was answering without words. "You don't need to catch up. You were never behind." That was the moment it all clicked. God's delays were not denials. They were divine alignments. Every door that had closed, every opportunity that had escaped him, had been protection in disguise. The waiting wasn't a pause in his purpose. It was preparation for it. He smiled through tears and whispered, "Then I'll wait, even if it's hard, even if it feels like nothing's happening." Outside, church bells began to toll, their sound rolling through the streets like a hymn that refused to fade. He rose from the pew, heart steady, mind clear. He didn't know what the next opportunity would look like, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not move until peace went with him that night. He returned home to find a new message waiting in his inbox. A different company, smaller, less flashy, but with a mission that stirred something deep in him. They had seen his portfolio online and wanted to interview him the next day. He smiled, reading it again and again. Not because it was the perfect offer, but because, this time, he didn't feel rushed. There was peace, and that was enough. He closed his laptop, looked out at the night sky, and whispered, "Okay, Lord, if this is you, I'll know in 24 hours. And once again, heaven smiled, because faith that waits is the faith that wins by sunrise. The world outside David's window seemed to hum with quiet anticipation. He rose before the alarm, feeling an unexplainable steadiness in his chest. Not excitement, not fear, but peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that numbed you into passivity. It was the kind that made you feel grounded, tethered to something eternal. Unseen, but unmistakably real. He prepared for the interview with calm precision, not rehearsing answers, but centering his spirit. The clock ticked softly, and with each second that passed, he whispered the same prayer under his breath. If this is you, Lord, open it. If it's not, close it so loudly I can't miss it. When the call came, he felt a rush of quiet awe, not because the voice on the other end sounded promising, but because he realized how different he was. The man who once made decisions out of fear had become the man who waited for confirmation. Every question they asked, he answered with clarity and humility. Every silence between sentences felt sacred. It wasn't just an interview. It was a test in trust, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't performing, he was abiding. When the call ended, he didn't rush to overthink or analyze. He simply closed his laptop and went for a walk. The morning was alive with the sound of birds, the smell of dew and dust, and dawn blending into one holy perfume. He wandered through the park near his apartment, the same one he used to walk through during sleepless nights when he felt lost. The same bench where he had once begged God for direction now felt like an altar. He sat there, looking up at the sky that had watched him wrestle, and whispered, "Thank you for making me wait." The wind moved through the trees like a slow, divine breath. Somewhere in that movement, he sensed it, not in words, but in presence. That subtle, holy reassurance that only comes when your spirit finally syncs with heaven's pace. He didn't need a voice to know what God was saying. It was written in everything around him, in the way the leaves shimmered, in the peace that wrapped his heart like sunlight. You've learned to pause. Now you're ready to move. Later that afternoon, his phone rang again. It was the same company. "David," the voice said warmly, "we'd like to officially offer you the position." He exhaled, not with surprise, but with quiet gratitude. He accepted the offer, not because it was perfect, but because the peace remained. And that was the difference. Now, he no longer chased doors that looked good. He followed the ones that felt right, the ones that resonated with that sacred calm only God could give. As he hung up, he felt tears well again, not of relief, but of realization. All along, the 24-hour rule wasn't about time. It was about trust, because when you give God the space of one full day, one rotation of surrender, He often does more in that silence than you could in a lifetime of striving. He looked around his apartment, the candle still on his desk, the open Bible resting where it always had, Proverbs marked with notes and underlines. The air shimmered faintly with the golden haze of afternoon light, and for a brief moment, it all felt like sacred ground. He whispered softly, "You were never late. Lord, I just had to slow down enough to meet you." The peace that followed was overwhelming. He knew that more decisions would come. More closed doors, more waiting rooms, more moments where heaven seemed silent. But now he also knew the truth. Silence was not absence. It was invitation, an invitation to listen deeper, to wait longer, and to trust more fully. Because sometimes God doesn't answer right away. Not because He's withholding something, but because He's preparing you to carry it. And when the moment finally comes, when the right door opens, you'll recognize His fingerprints all over it, glowing like light through stained glass. He smiled as he looked out at the sunset, the sky now painted in shades of copper and rose. Another day had turned, another rotation completed, and somewhere in that stillness, he could almost hear it, faint but clear, a whisper carried through time itself. "You waited. Now watch what I do next."